Well, welcome, and thank you for joining today's EIM Governing Body General Session. Before we begin, please ensure you've opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the host. Please note at this time that all audio connections are muted. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. With that, I'll turn the call over to Roger Collington for roll.
Good morning, and thank you, everyone. Let me go ahead and take roll for the governing body. Chair Prescott.
Here.
Val Fong.
Here.
Anita Decker.
Here.
Rob Konzioka.
Here.
And Carl Linville. I think Carl was having some technical problems. Were you able to get on, Carl? Okay. Well, at this point, we can proceed. We have a quorum, and I presume Carl...
I think my line has been unmuted now.
Oh, there you go. Glad to hear you. Okay, Carl is here. All right, awesome. So we have not only a quorum, but the full complement of the governing body, and I will turn it back to you, Chair Prescott.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Sorry to everyone for the delay, just some technical difficulties we had to iron out. First up on our agenda is public comment. Now, this is public comment not related to any of our decisional items on the agenda. We'll be asking for public comment on those specific items at that time. So, operator, do you want to ask if there's any general comments from the public?
If you'd like to make a general comment, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, at which point please state your name and comment. Again, at this time, please dial #2 if you'd like to make a general comment. I'm not showing any comments at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I think I was looking down too much and everybody was looking at my bald head, so. As it is. Okay, next up, I think we have Roger on the general session minutes.
I won't comment on the prior comment, but yes, we have, I need a motion for the September 16th, 2020 general session minutes. Can I have a first?
So moved. So moved.
And second?
This is Rob. I'll second.
And all in favor? And actually, why don't I do it this way, since we can't see everyone, not everyone can see everyone. Let me go ahead and just take the vote. John?
Aye.
Val?
Aye.
Anita?
Aye.
Rob?
Aye.
And Carl?
Aye.
Thank you, governing body members. Back to you, Chair Prescott.
Okay, very good. Next up on our agenda is a governance review committee update from Therese Hampton, the chair of that committee. So if we can get her on the line.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to give you an update on the Governance Review Committee. Just a little bit of background of where we are in the process. As a reminder, we issued a straw proposal at the end of July, took comments through the month of August, and then held a stakeholder workshop in September. And so with all of that information, kind of what we've been doing since that point in time is we have been looking at all the written comments, all the verbal comments that we got at the stakeholder workshop, and have broken the Governance Review Committee down into 3 different work groups. And each of the work groups are looking at specific issues. We've broken into a delegation of authority working group, stakeholder engagement working group, and then kind of a catch-all that we call the other issues work group. And those work groups have been taking kind of each of the issues that have been identified by stakeholders and really working through them, understanding the stakeholder perspective, looking at options, and then kind of if there needs to be some kind of legal questions asked or different kind of review, working through that and then bringing that forward to the full governance review committee. We are still in that process of the subgroups bringing the work to the full governance review committee. And last week, on October 28th, we held a public session. We wanted to kind of engage with stakeholders both about schedule, talk a little bit about this process that we're going through, and then give them a little bit of color and insight into some of the issues that we're working through. I'll kind of hit a couple of them, not all of them for you, but the Delegation of Authority Working Group in particular has some focus areas looking to kind of better articulate or kind of delineate the scope of what's under joint authority versus those things that would be solely under the ISO Board of Governors authority. We're also working through a lot of different questions about dispute resolution. So there were dispute resolution proposals in the straw proposal. We did get a fair number of stakeholder comments on that. So we're working through those and thinking about dispute resolution mechanisms. On the Stakeholder Engagement Working Group, there were recommendations about the Regional Issues Forum and kind of modifying a bit some of the language around the Regional Issues Forum and kind of the purpose and focus of that group. So we're working through how do you memorialize some of those changes and looking at the Regional Issues Forum sector definitions and seeing whether those still are applicable. In the other issues work group, certainly there continues to be conversation about the outside market experts, and then a topic that came up kind of new in the last round of comments was tariff consistency and EIM entity tariffs. And so we received some comments specifically on that on the October 28th, at the October 28th public meeting. So that's kind of where we're at. We still have a goal of getting out a revised straw proposal by mid-December. We have promised stakeholders we'll be very mindful of the holiday season and not, kind of ask for a quick turnaround of comments in early January if we do get it out by mid-December. And we still have a goal of trying to get a proposed final by the end of Q1 2021. That's a tight turnaround, but we've still got it on the schedule. We're optimistic if we kind of move through this and get a good revised straw proposal out, we can maintain that schedule. So that's all I have for an update. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Therese. Any questions from the governing body? Okay, hearing nothing, we appreciate the work of you and your team, which includes Val and Anita as alternate. So a lot of work being done there, and we look forward to the progress. Thank you, Therese.
Thanks.
Okay, next up we have Body of State Regulators update from the chair of the BAAS, Commissioner Tawney from the state of Oregon.
Good morning. This is Commissioner Tawney, first doing a sound check.
Yes, we can hear you just fine, Commissioner.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to provide another BAASer update to you all. Of course, Letha Tawney. I currently serve as a commissioner at the Oregon Public Utility Commission and as the BAASer chair. Since the BAASer's last update to you on September 16th, like everyone else, we have been very busy. We held the BAASer leadership elections in October, and I'm pleased to announce that the current leadership team was reelected for another year. So I've been reelected to serve a second year as the chair. Chair Fornstrom from Wyoming has been reelected to serve a second year as the vice chair of the BAASer. And Chair Williamson of Nevada has been reelected to serve the next year as the BAASer's representative on the EIM nominating committee. If you recall, she was elected earlier this year to finish the term that had been begun by Commissioner White before his departure from the Utah Commission. This would have been a really challenging year for transition, so I'm really pleased everyone was willing to continue serving. And we continue to have a great team moving forward alongside Commissioner Chris Raper, who, of course, is representing the BAASer on the Governance Review Committee. And I just want to thank all of them for their hard work in keeping up with this busy season of CAISO issues. It's a challenge for all of us, I know. Last Monday, October 26th, we held our 2020 Fall EIM BAASer meeting, and this would have normally been one of our two biannual meetings in person, but of course, COVID. So we had a fantastic webinar session instead. We had the opportunity to welcome Elliot Mainzer to his new position. Elliot had a fantastic discussion with Ann Rendall, a commissioner from Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission, and Tony Braun, who represents various public power interests in the West and who you know well from the GRC. They discussed some of the issues facing the CAISO on the near-term horizon, such as the resource adequacy questions and the evolving codependencies in the West. And really a good discussion, I thought, on the importance of a broad representation of perspectives in governance. We look forward to strengthening our already good relationship with CAISO under Elliot's leadership from the Northwest. I think we're sorry to see him leave the Northwest, but very excited to see what he'll bring to the CAISO conversation, and really appreciate him taking time so early in his tenure to spend some time with us. We also had two educational panels, really trying to build on the October 14th through 18th heat wave events, use those as a learning moment for the BAASer members. I think there are, of course, a slew of questions about those events that are important for the region, but they also illustrated some of the features of the market that we tend to conceptually struggle with a little bit more, since the CAISO isn't our day job, and we have to keep learning and approaching and reapproaching market issues so that we really understand them and how they come home to our different states. So we had an explanation of price formation in the EIM and how the CAISO scarcity events impacted prices outside of CAISO, and some good discussion there of locational marginal pricing. So started to really wrap our heads around why prices diverge in different parts of the West in the CAISO algorithms as the CAISO algorithms seek the most efficient solution given congestion. And we also had a panel on convergence bidding and the role it plays in an organized market, how it impacts the market, particularly during tight conditions, and the challenges convergence bidding might present in an EDAM scenario. So I think that was a really helpful panel for starting to help us unpack when do you use convergence bidding and what really do you use it for in the market. Drawing from a variety of resources, including the CAISO's Department of Market Monitoring, the Market Surveillance Committee, EIM entities, and expertise, we were really fortunate to have an excellent group of speakers, and I want to thank all of those organizations and the individuals for their support on our educational efforts. We were really pleased to have great attendance from across the West, including some of you all, and we're really so glad that we can do those sessions in an open way and make the most of that training opportunity. We've heard some positive feedback from commissioners on those sessions, and we'll keep trying to build that education for ourselves, but also for stakeholders that want to join us. As we just heard, the GRC process continues, and we've been very engaged. We're working to be prepared for that draft proposal in December that we heard about. And we continue to ensure that our discussions are really broad-based. So there are, of course, a range of states in the West, in the WEC, that are not yet live on the EIM. We continue to engage their commissioners fully in the BAASer and to take their positions and issues into consideration so that when they go live and are officially full-fledged members, they sort of have had a chance to build their understanding, but also are fully comfortable with where we have landed as the BAASer. So those states are folded in quite early. At the October BAASer monthly meeting, we continued our discussion on options for BAASer funding in that open forum. We are working with the state-regulated market participants, essentially the IOUs, in the EIM to explore an out-of-market funding mechanism. I think there are many points of consensus in the draft term sheet, and we have some conversations to continue within the BAASer to find our own consensus, particularly around the funding allocation formula. But we've been making good progress on finding common ground, and we'll continue to keep the GRC and stakeholders apprised as our positions really emerge in that consensus process. We really want to commend the GRC and appreciate their holding a public meeting last week, providing an update on their progress and gathering feedback on some of the outstanding issues. We find, because of how our own commissions operate, but also just more generally, we really encourage the GRC to continue to make those meetings open. We find that the insights into those debates are really powerful and helpful, and I think it will really help build confidence in the compromises that will eventually, in a very healthy way, emerge from that process. And so we really appreciate that effort that they put into a public session and look forward to more. We also continue to follow a number of market design initiatives that are currently in stakeholder process, particularly EDAM, and our training, as you can see, is all geared towards trying to be ready for those conversations so we can be really effective in our engagement. Our next meeting is November 13th. It'll be open, and we'll turn our attention back to our EIM governance issues and the governance review. You can always find our schedule and details on the BAASer website that Western Interstate Energy Board hosts for us. And I am happy to take any questions now, and always my door is open if anyone has questions at another time.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner Tawney. Any questions for her? Okay, hearing nothing but maybe a dog bark, which is a sign of approval. Thank you for that report, and thanks for agreeing to serve again as chair. I know it's a time commitment, but we really do appreciate all your efforts. So thank you for that, and thank you for your report.
Thank you.
Okay, next up, we have a report on the Regional Issues Forum from Pam Sporborg from Portland General, and she's the chair of that forum. Pam?
Pam, please dial #2. There you are.
Hi, this is Pam Sporborg with the Regional Issues Forum. We are continuing with our virtual meeting, and our next session will be coming up in early December. While we are working to finalize the agenda, we will be discussing transmission in the EIM and distributed energy resource participation in the EIM. As Therese pointed out, we are also reviewing the comments and recommendations that address the role of the Regional Issues Forum as part of the Governance Review Committee. We are monitoring the changes proposed to the RIF, and we are considering what steps the RIF will need to take to incorporate and address these recommendations in the Regional Issues Forum operating guidelines. We'll also take the opportunity to enhance the process and transparency around the liaison selection process in our operating guidelines. Finally, Jennifer Gardner will be stepping down as the liaison for the public interest groups and as the vice chair. We will certainly miss Jennifer's passion, curiosity, and leadership, but we wish her the best in her new endeavors. We'll be working through the process of selecting a new liaison and a new vice chair in the coming weeks. And with that, that concludes my report. I will be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you for that report, Pam. Any questions from the governing body for Pam?
John, this is Rob. I've got one.
Go ahead.
Pam, good morning. Thank you for that update. If you are able to, can you expand or elaborate on the work that the RIF might be doing with respect to resource adequacy? there's a lot of activity going on across the West, and I was just curious as to what particular angle or objective you might have.
We have not addressed resource adequacy within the Regional Issues Forum to date. It is a topic we have discussed having a presentation on in the past, but we have focused more on resource sufficiency, which is within the EIM marketplace, whereas the resource adequacy conversations are really going on outside of the CAISO framework. We have, I believe it was about this time last year, we had a presentation on the difference between resource sufficiency and resource adequacy that I think was helpful in framing up some of the understanding between what goes on in the EIM market and what goes on outside of the EIM market. But it's certainly a topic we could address in the future as these changes become more clear.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
Okay, hearing nothing, thank you so much for that report, Pam. We appreciate your leadership and the work of the RIF.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on in our agenda, next up, item 6, is a briefing on the Hybrid Resources Phase 2 proposal and our decision, which is an advisory role decision. So first up is the management presentation, and it's either going to be Mark or Greg, whoever wants to kick that off.
Yeah, this is Mark Rothleader. This is a second phase of this item. We brought this briefing on hybrid resources, more specifically co-located, to you earlier this year. And this is the second part of this to deal with more specifically with a true hybrid resources instead of the co-located. With that, I will turn it over to Greg Cook, and then Ryan Kerlinski from the Department of Market Monitoring will follow up on their perspective on this item.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so this is our briefing on the Hybrid Resources Phase 2. I'll start off, both of the Hybrid Resources Phase 1 and Phase 2 proposals are being driven by the strong developer interest we're having in adding storage facilities, in particular to existing solar and other sites. We're looking at, by the end of 2021, having an additional 1,500 megawatts of storage added to existing sites by this time next year. And next slide, please. So I'll start with a little background. As a reminder, we're proposing two options for hybrid resource owners to choose from. The first is the co-located resource option, which was we presented at your last EIM governing body meeting in June, which was subsequently approved by the board in July. And if you recall, this model has individual resource IDs for each of the generators behind the point of interconnection, and this allows for us to model each component like we would other resources on the grid today. And we do this by, we're going to be implementing an aggregate capability constraint at that point of interconnection. The one we're focused on today is the hybrid resource model, and this one's different in that we would have a single resource ID that would aggregate the multiple generators behind that single point of interconnection. And with this model, the ISO would then only have the visibility into a single resource. And the benefit here is this allows flexibility for the hybrid resource operator to manage the resource. And some of the stakeholders have indicated that this is particularly important for resources trying to manage their investment tax credits. So this was what we're presenting this to you today, and this will go forward for an ISO board decision in November. Next slide, please. So the proposal we're presenting today includes not only the enhanced market rules for the hybrid resources, but also some additional functionality for the co-located resources as well as a new data requirement for the wind and solar components. So, first, for the new provisions for managing the hybrid resources, we would be having provisions that would allow the resource to provide both energy and ancillary services, and we're also providing some functionality that would allow those resource owners to communicate their generation availability on a 5-minute basis in real time. Looking at the enhanced functionality as well as accommodations for the co-located resources, we're including additional provisions that would allow those co-located resources to provide ancillary services. So here we would be expanding the aggregate capability constraint from the original proposal that is being implemented this fall to also include awards for ancillary services in addition to energy, and we would anticipate that would then be implemented with the hybrid resource functionality in the fall of 2021. And then we're also proposing to allow co-located storage resources the opportunity to deviate from their dispatch instructions under some limited circumstances in order to avoid some renewable curtailments. And then finally, we're proposing some new requirements for the hybrid and co-located resources that they would have to provide data on their wind and solar components. So I'll get into each of these in a little more detail here in a second. Next slide, please. So the hybrid resource phase 2 proposal that is being presented today falls under your advisory role. The reasoning being that this new functionality is available broadly to both the ISM and EIM balancing authority areas, and the rules would apply generally to the entire market. And as a result, this falls under the EIM governing body's advisory role. Next slide, please. Looking at the, a proposal includes that new dynamic limit tool for the hybrid resource operators. And this is necessary because these resources face some unique challenges because their output is really dependent on the maximum capability of the variable energy resource component, either the wind or solar component, as well as the state of charge of the battery. So we worked through the stakeholder process and decided that a dynamic limit tool would be a good way to address these issues, as it would enable these hybrid resources to communicate their actual generating potential to the ISO, and would also allow those resources to specify both their upper and lower operational limits for each 5-minute interval, and that would go out 3 hours into the future. Next slide, please. As was brought up during the phase 1 part of this initiative, stakeholders requested that the co-located resources be provided an accommodation to deviate from dispatch instructions, and this is particularly as a means of reducing the amount of curtailment of the renewable resource component. So in response to that, we are proposing to allow the co-located resources to deviate from dispatch instructions under some limited conditions. First, we would allow this deviation if the following 3 conditions were met. First, the co-located resource must be producing above dispatch, and in that event, if it were producing above dispatch, that it would otherwise, that would be violating that point of interconnection limit. And then finally, the co-located resource may not be having any ancillary service awards during this period either. So if all those 3 conditions are met, the storage resource then would be allowed to charge to avoid curtailing the renewable resource component. A couple other details on this. The ISO would not be facilitating that information sharing. That would have to be done outside of the ISO by the co-located resource operators, and then those deviations would be settled as uninstructed energy through the ISO market. Next slide, please. Our proposal also includes new provisions for collecting the data from wind and solar components, and this is necessary for ISO's forecasting needs. So in particular, we're requiring a high sustainable limit data be provided from both the wind and solar components, and this would be for either the co-located or the hybrid resources. And this would provide us the real-time telemetry data on what the maximum expected output of either the wind or solar component would be. And this information is what we would use then to forecast the potential output of the wind and solar resource components, and as a result, the ISO would then have a better visibility into the capability of the resource throughout the operating day. So next slide. So stakeholders are supportive of our proposal. I think as in general, most stakeholders recognize that this is providing a new market tools for the emerging technology. Admittedly, this is a first step. We're trying to get these provisions in place relatively quickly, as these resources will be, as I mentioned, coming online next year, a significant amount of them. Also, through the stakeholder process, we were able to incorporate feedback that we got from stakeholders in developing the dynamic limit tool. We had originally proposed that their availability be inform the ISO through outage cards. That was shown to be somewhat onerous, and so we were able to work out a solution by using the dynamic limit tool, which is a much less administratively burdensome solution. But finally, we do have a number of stakeholders that are continuing.
Greg? Did we lose Greg? Can we still hear him?
I can hear you, John.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry, my mic died.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I was going. I'm not sure exactly when it cut out there. I was going through the stakeholder positions, but I was mentioning the feedback from the stakeholders was instrumental in helping us work out the dynamic limit tool instead of using outage cards for relaying the resource availability to the ISO. And then finally, there are continuing concerns that stakeholders would like to see additional functionality, in particular for the co-located resources. I think what they would like to be able to deviate not only by charging the storage component when the renewable component is producing above forecast, but they would also like to be able to discharge that storage component when the renewable component is producing below the forecast. This is something we considered, but at this point we have some concerns with that from an operational standpoint, because this would reduce our certainty as to knowledge on what the actual state of charge of the battery may be as we're looking into the future. We're comfortable with the deviations in the charging direction, because then we know that storage resource would be charged as much or more than we had expected it to be. But, that being said, this would be something that we'll consider further when we have the hybrid resource evolution initiative, which we're planning to take on next year. And that initiative will also help be informed by some of the experience we received by operating these resources in the earlier part of the year. So next slide. So in closing, we're requesting that the ISO governing body support our hybrid resources proposal. We believe it provides the improved functionality to manage the resources under a single ID, if so chosen by the hybrid resource operators. It also enables both the co-located and the hybrid resources to provide ancillary services. And finally, the requirements for the additional data will improve our forecasting abilities by providing that estimate of the generation capabilities for both the wind and the solar components of both the hybrid and the co-located resources. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, governing body, any questions for Greg before we move on?
Yeah, this is Val. I just have a quick one, Greg. And I don't think you gave an indication of this, but I was wondering if with the development of the hybrid resources proposal, you would see significant migration of resources from the co-located to the hybrid resources model.
Yeah, that's a good question, Val. Right now, what has been indicated to us, as I mentioned, we're expecting about 1,500 megawatts of storage being added to as hybrid resources by the end of 2021. To date, 1,000 megawatts of that 1,500 megawatts has indicated that they would be using the co-located model. So there's 500 that is not unspecified at this point, so it could be up to 500 megawatts. But that remains to be seen. But I think we expect that at least some indications are at this point that the majority would be under the co-located resource model. The other point on this is the hybrid. I think the big advantage of the hybrid model is it allows direct control of their investment tax credits, but again, those tax credits will be sunsetting here, I believe, 5 years into the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation.
You bet.
Any other questions for Greg? Okay, thank you, Greg. I guess next up we have Ryan from DMM.
Hi, this is Ryan Kurlinski from the Department of Market Monitoring. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you, Chair Prescott and EIM governing body for the opportunity to provide DMM's views on this initiative today. The ISO's hybrid resource model proposal seems reasonable as a first attempt to get something in place quickly to help incorporate the new hybrid storage technologies that are coming online. When there are significant interactions between the two components of our hybrid resource, we think it makes sense to have a hybrid model, so we support the ISO developing this option. The proposal has some issues that the ISO has acknowledged, but we think they can be addressed as enhancements in their hybrid evolution initiative next year. The first issue is that the ISO is going to implement the initial design with hybrid resources being exempt from market power mitigation. So we appreciate the ISO committing to developing mitigation in their hybrid evolution initiative next year. The second issue is that the ISO is proposing to let hybrid resources declare their own dynamic limits. As ISO has acknowledged, these limits could be automated by the ISO, and so we encourage the ISO to also develop that enhancement in their evolution initiative next year. That's because in the absence of automating the dynamic limits, a hybrid resource could have a lot of ability to withhold charging or supply capacity from the grid. So a critical aspect of the ISO's proposal is that they are requiring every hybrid to provide data that will allow the ISO and DMM to monitor that the dynamic limits are being used appropriately until the ISO can automate them. The key data includes the variable energy resource component forecast and the storage component states of charge. The ISO has these data provision requirements in its proposal, so DMM supports this initial hybrid model design. Thanks again, and I would be happy to try to address any questions you may have for me.
Okay, any questions for Ryan? Okay, thank you, Ryan. Great report. Really appreciate that. Okay, next up on the agenda is when we turn to public comment. So, operator, if you want to open up the lines and ask for public comment.
If you'd like to make a public comment at this time, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, at which point please state your name and comment. Again, now is the time to dial #2 on your telephone keypad. All right, we do have a commenter. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Good morning. My name is Joseph Aboliman. I'm calling from the Public Advocate's Office of the California Public Utilities Commission. I don't really have a comment, but I do have a question on slide 12 of the hybrid resource presentation. Now, in the last bullet, you noted that the resource deviations will be settled as uninstructed energy. I don't know what that means. Could you please elaborate on that? I'm not sure whether you mean uninstructed or unobstructed. So I wanted to be sure I hear correctly what you stated. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Greg Cook. So we would be settling these as uninstructed energy in our market. There's different costs that are allocated to instructed energy versus uninstructed energy. One example would be, for example, the flexible ramping product costs are allocated, part of those costs are allocated to uninstructed energy, so those costs are not then allocated to instructed energy. So it has a difference in how the settlement is, ultimately runs through the ISO market. It doesn't tend to be most of the time doesn't tend to be a significant difference between what is ultimately settled for instructed and uninstructed, but there are, additional costs that are allocated to uninstructed energy.
This is Mark Roth there. In addition to that, the uninstructed energy is settled at the real-time 5-minute price, correct, Greg?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that question. Operator, any other questions?
I'm not showing any other questions at this time.
Okay, thank you so much. So now we'll move on to the governing body decision. And recall this is an advisory role, so we'll be deciding whether or not we would advise the Board of Governors to approve this, and if so, do we do that with a written or verbal report? So anybody have any discussion points, thoughts? Okay, I'm not.
Well, so this is Val, and it does seem like there's, or at least from everything I can read, there's general support for this initiative. So I'm ready to go ahead and recommend the ISO's proposal.
And do you have any thought on written or verbal on this one?
Yeah, I think verbal is fine.
Okay. Yeah, and I would agree with that too. And I know there's more work to be done on this, but I think this is a great next step. So I really appreciate all the efforts and look forward to more on this. So I guess at that point, there's a motion up on the screen if somebody wants to make that motion, filling in the blanks as necessary.
Well, I think that would be my job.
Okay.
So let me go ahead and read that motion as I understand and we can go from there. Move that the EIM governing body will provide verbal advisory input to the ISO Board of Governors as discussed at its September 16, 2000. Oh, we got some dates wrong here. As discussed at its November 4, 2020 general session meeting. I think Stacy's just trying to make sure I'm paying attention. It's November 4th, 2020 general session meeting supporting management's hybrid resources phase 2 proposal.
Hello, this is Val.
Second, this is Carl.
Carl second, and I will go ahead and take the vote count. Anita?
Aye.
Val?
Yes.
Rob?
Aye.
Carl?
Aye.
And John?
Aye.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for that one. So moving on to our next agenda item 7, which is a discussion on pseudo ties of shared resources. And on this one, we have a primary authority, and so we'll be discussing whether we approve this or not. So with that, I'll turn it over, again, probably to Mark to kick it off.
Thank you. Yeah, on this one is a hybrid decision item, and this is a item that really came about and is supportive of some of the next rounds of EIM entities that are coming on the system, so that some of their resources that are currently participating in the ISO market can continue to do so. At least a portion of those resources can continue to do so. So with that, I will hand it over to Greg to explain this one further.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning again. So we started this initiative to address issues with entities that have shares of a generation resource in a non-EIM balancing authority area that serve load in the California ISO balancing authority area. And when these balancing authority has then become EIM balancing authority areas, there can be some issues with it, which I'll get into. And in particular, the LADWP will be joining the EIM this spring as a number of shared resources that serve load within the California ISO balancing authority area. Next slide, please. So to address this, we're proposing some new provisions to accommodate those EIM area entities with shares of resources that serve load in the ISO balancing authority area. And The issue is today we have those shares of resources in non-EIM balancing authority areas that serve that load in the ISO balancing authority area. They're serving that load through dynamic schedules. Now, dynamic schedules are essentially a way to automate the real-time dispatch and as well as the interchange schedule adjustments to accommodate this. However, it becomes somewhat problematic when that balancing authority area becomes an EIM balancing authority area. And the reason being is that it can present some conflicts with the EIM transfers and the real-time interchange accounting that could have impacts on both the pricing and dispatch. And as a result, this could result in inconsistencies between dispatches and bids for dynamically scheduled resources. So we can solve this problem by converting those dynamic schedules to pseudo ties. And a pseudo tie is different in that it logically transfers the resource from its physical location to the California ISO balancing authority area, and which means that it avoids the market inefficiencies that could arise if the resource continues to be dynamically scheduled because it's no longer included in the interchange accounting. You know, that being said, we would still allow those resources to choose to be dynamically scheduled, but they would have to be, you know, accepting of the potential inefficiencies that can come along with that. Next slide, please. So our proposal includes two key provisions to facilitate the pseudo tie of shared resources. Well, the issue is today the ISO only allows an entire resource to be connected to the ISO balancing authority area as a pseudo tie, and that requirement was the result of a previous metering rule that required generation resources to have energy meters that could be read directly by the ISO. However, back in 2016, we had a metering initiative where the ISO changed its metering rules, and one of those changes was to allow resource operators to calculate and submit meter readings for a share of the resource's output. And then secondly, which now would allow us to accommodate the pseudo-tying of shared resources, but then the second key provision that we need is we're proposing what we're calling the shared resource allocation protocol, and this would document the various operating characteristics, commitment costs, big cost recovery, outage coordination, and the other aspects that we would need to coordinate the use of the resources. So this will both ensure that we have the equitable allocation of bid cost recovery and provide us with the means to monitor for compliance, but it also establishes equitable and enforceable cost allocation provisions. So these two provisions together will enable the ISO to pseudo-tie shares of generation resources to the California ISO balancing authority area. Next slide, please. As Mark mentioned, this proposal falls under the EIM governing body's hybrid decisional role, and what this requires is both approval by the EIM governing body as well as the board. The reason for this hybrid role is that the EIM governing body has the primary authority over the tariff provisions that we're proposing that impact the real-time market. The primary driver for this initiative was an issue that is specific to EIM balancing authority areas. However, there's also tariff provisions that would apply to the day-ahead market that are not severable from the real-time market provision. So as a result, the initiative is not severable, and therefore it falls under the hybrid decisional role and must be, again, be approved by both the governing body as well as the ISO board. Next slide, please. So stakeholders support our proposal for pseudo-tie of shared resources. We were able to iron out the stakeholder concerns through the stakeholder process. We addressed some initial comments by adding additional explanations through the stakeholder process as well as in LADWP's EIM implementation planning. We also, in the response to comments in the draft final proposal, added some details on the pricing issues that would come about from the dynamic schedules, also provided additional documentation of how we would do the outage allocation and enforcement of the cost allocation. So once we put that out there, we did not receive any other concerns raised with the final proposal that was ultimately posted. Next slide, please. So with that, we're requesting that the EIM governing body approve our proposal for pseudo ties of shared resources. Again, it will use existing systems to support those entities that have a share of generation in an EIM balancing authority area and have load that they need to serve in the California ISO balancing authority area. And so by doing so, this proposal extends the ISO's pseudo tie mechanism to shared resources by leveraging the more flexible metering rules that were previously established in a previous stakeholder process. And finally, the shared allocation protocol will provide us with the information we need for outage allocations and for dealing with flexibility for differing circumstances, as well as the equitable allocation of cost allocation. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions from the governing body for Greg?
Yeah, this is Rob. I've got 2 questions for Greg.
Okay.
Greg, thank you for that overview. I think this was a really positive proposal that has been put forward. The first question I have deals with it's just a technicality on the treatment of the remaining resource. So if the partial generator is pseudo tie, how will the remaining portion be treated by the Cal ISO? Does the other owner or owners have flexibility to decide or choose how they want it treated? And then the other question I have is, and I know this was not a driver for this particular initiative, but could you opine at all on any RNA implications by this proposal?
Yeah, so the first question, how would this be treated, how would we treat the remaining shares of the resource? So those remaining shares of the resource would remain in the physically located balancing authority area. Again, that's the shared resource allocation protocol would define, again, how those, the various costs would be allocated among the shares. But, it would be dispatched and bid in through that external BA as opposed to being treated like the share that is being pseudo-tied into the ISO balancing authority area as what should be treated as a resource that was within the California ISO balancing authority area. And then the second question on implications for resource adequacy, there will be implications for that. We did not address that in this initiative. It was somewhat purposefully narrowly scoped so that we could have these provisions completed in time for, again, the EIM implementations that are coming this spring. We do, however, have an initiative on our policy initiatives roadmap for a jointly owned unit modeling initiative, that's where we'll start digging into how we would be able to address those resource adequacy type issues.
Thank you, Greg.
You bet.
I have a quick question. This is Val. Greg, I think there's something called the protocol administrator that's associated with, it's the one entity that will be submitting in the schedules and whatnot. And there has to be sort of this allocator, part of your shared resource allocation protocol, the allocations between what goes into the CAISO and what stays within the other BAA. That plan, is that set in time at the beginning of time? Does it get modified by season? Does it get modified by year? I was just kind of wondering a little bit about the mechanics. And you don't have to go into great detail, but I just wanted to have a general sense for that.
Yeah, that's a good question, Val, and I don't have a answer for you at this point. I mean, those types of provisions would be worked out through the implementation process and included in our business practice manuals, but I imagine there would be means for some flexibility there.
Yeah, I think, this is Mark out there, I think the expectation is that if there were circumstances that change, and I know one of them that may be relevant is contracting arrangements, how much of it is contracted within the EIM balancing area versus the portion that's coming to the ISO. Those could change on a seasonal or varying basis, and that may be one of the reasons why the protocol could be updated, or the protocol would acknowledge those different time frames and arrangements, and it would be built into those protocols.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Greg or Mark? Okay, next up is we have public comment on this issue. Operator, if you want to ask for public comments.
So first we have the Department of Market Monitoring, I believe.
Sorry, Ryan, you're up.
This is Ryan Krasinski from the Department of Market Monitoring again. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, man. Great. DMM supports the ISO's final proposal. We appreciate the importance of the ISO working with stakeholders to develop a shared resource design that could increase participation in the Western EIM and CAISO markets. This proposal allows a lot of important flexibility for resource owners to define the details of how the resource will be split between balancing areas. Early in the process, we pointed out that this flexibility could, in some cases, allow for some inflation or inequitable allocation of an uplift payment to generators called bid cost recovery. Now, this is an uplift that gets paid by the balancing area that each generator is in, so we recommended some protections. And the ISO addressed these concerns effectively by making many key features of the splitting plan public and by adding the authority for the ISO to revoke or suspend the agreement if a splitting plan is causing these bid cost recovery issues. So we support the final proposal, and I would be happy to try to address any questions you may have.
Hey, thank you, Ryan. Any questions from the governing body for Ryan? Hey, nothing heard. Thanks again, Ryan, for your update. We really do appreciate that.
Thanks.
Okay, now we go to public comment, operator.
All right, if you'd like to make a public comment at this time, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, at which point please state your name, affiliation, and comment. All right, we do have a caller in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Bonnie Blair. I represent the Six Cities group. I just wanted to flag for the governing body's attention something that's mentioned in the memo that I think accompanied the presentation, but it wasn't called out in the presentation, and that is that this pseudo tie arrangement is an optional arrangement for a shared resource. And that was something that was very important to the group that I represent, that it not be compulsory, and that optionality was very important in addressing initial concerns that the Six Cities group had. So I just wanted to flag that for the governing body's attention. It is referenced in the memo.
Okay, thank you,
This is Greg. I'll just confirm that is correct. It is optional. They can continue to use dynamic schedules if they prefer.
Yeah, that is an important point, so thank you for that comment. We do appreciate it. Any other comments in the queue?
I'm not showing any other comments at this time.
Okay, thank you, operator. So at this time, we go to the governing body for our decision, remembering this is a hybrid authority. Any thoughts and discussion? Well, if we're all in agreement, I guess, if we're gonna, I would approve it. I think it's very reasonable, and I think it does a lot to bring more resources to the EIM, which is what we're doing. So it just, for a lot of reasons, I think this is a good one to approve. So anybody have any problems with it?
John, this is Rob. I concur with your comments. I think this is a very common sense approach, and I think it's very reasonable, and I think it's very positive.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. So I guess with that, Mr. Collington, I guess it's yours.
Okay. Move that the EIM governing body, under its hybrid authority, approves the proposal for pseudo ties of shared resources described in the memorandum dated October 28, 2020, including any associated Federal Energy Regulatory Commission filings, including such filings that implement the overarching initiative policy but contain discrete revisions to incorporate Commission guidance in any initial ruling on the proposed tariff amendment. And before I go ahead and take your vote, let me just explain that last part briefly. You haven't seen that before in your motions because you haven't had a hybrid motion. And under the hybrid authority, you approve the full initiative, and then the board will consider it at its next meeting. But as part of that approval, under recent precedent from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, recent meaning in the last year or so, that we must make sure if the commission comes back and gives us comments and feedback in such a way on that we need to revise the policy, but it still fits within, or we need to revise our tariff filing, it still fits within the policy that you have approved, that avoids us having to come back to you as a technical matter and get it approved again. We've been doing this is the NRG decision out of FERC, and we've been doing this for some time with the board now since that decision came out, and we added that. So again, that's why you're seeing that language for the first time. So with that, that's the motion, and I'll seek if there's someone that wants to move in a second.
So moved.
I'm sorry, who was that? Anita?
Anita.
Okay, and second?
Second, Val.
Okay.
Gotta be quick. It's like playing Jeopardy. Okay. And let me go ahead and take your vote. Anita?
Roger, this is Rob. Before you take the vote, I just have a clarification question. So ultimately, should the governing body approve this motion, the Board of Governors will receive a separate but parallel motion, assuming they move forward.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? All right, let me move forward. Anita?
Yes.
Val?
Yes.
Rob?
Aye.
Carl?
Yes.
And John?
Aye.
Thank you, governing body members. The motion passes.
Okay, thank you, Roger, and I will be presenting this information to the Board of Governors at their next meeting. Okay, moving on. Item number 8 on our agenda is a briefing on the variable operations and maintenance cost review proposal, and our decision on this will be an advisory role to the Board of Governors. So with that, we'll go to management's presentation, Mark, and I think we have to queue up Guillermo.
Yeah, as Guillermo's queuing up, this is an item, advisory item, that really comes about from our triennial review of variable operation and maintenance costs that we perform. And in fact, we performed that back in 2018. And as a result of that and the stakeholder discussions around that, we identified that we needed to clarify or develop some broader principles about the application and the determination of what goes into these variable O&M costs. And so this is the result of that broader consideration going forward. So with that, I will hand it off to Guillermo Bautista-Alderete, and DMM, Department of Market Monitoring, Emilia Blanque, will be providing some perspective about this item as well, because the Department of Market Monitoring does provide a agent role in regards to performing negotiations regarding some of these costs. So with that, I will hand it off to Dr. Bautista-Alderete.
Thank you, Mark. This is Guillermo. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Members of the EIM governing body, good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm bringing to you the proposal for variable operations and maintenance cost review initiative. A key input to the CAISO market is the generation cost. These costs are captured through resource bids. However, some components of these costs are actually calculated by CAISO. We refer to these components as cost others. One of those is the variable operations and maintenance other. Currently, the viewing others are set in the tariff with very specific default values. These default others were introduced in 2012. Back then, we also committed to review and update those as needed every 3 years. As part of this regular review, in 2018, we found that we need to have a more extensive assessment of the operations and maintenance cost framework overall. In October 2019, the ISO formalized this effort in a stakeholder initiative that we call the Variable Operations and Maintenance Cost Review. After a year of policy development, we are bringing this proposal to you under the advisory role. Next slide, please. This initiative proposes to improve how operations and maintenance costs are accounted and estimated in the ISO market, and it has two main components. The first component proposes explicit principles for use in the categorization of operations and maintenance costs. Having a well-defined set of cost principles will allow for a simpler, more consistent, less onerous negotiations between participants and the ISO. It will also provide reference categories to simplify the 3-year review of the default operations and maintenance other values. The second component provides for an enhanced cost framework to update the default values for operations and maintenance others. This new framework also estimates a default value for certain operations and maintenance costs that currently don't have a default value and thus may potentially reduce the need for some participants to engage in negotiations in the first place. These two components will improve transparency and certainty. It will also lead to a more efficient market by having better cost framework and decrease the administrative burden on market participants and the ISO. Next slide, please. Under the current operations and maintenance cost framework, we have two types of others. One is called the variable operations and maintenance others, and the other is the major maintenance others. The variable operations and maintenance others have a set of default values applicable by technology. Participants can also negotiate a resource-specific other if needed. Major maintenance others are derived for each resource based on a dedicated negotiation with the ISO, in which the Department of Market Monitoring is currently acting as our agent. The ISO includes these others in what we call resource reference levels. This includes the resource default energy bid, the commitment cost that serve as bid caps. The default energy bid, just for your reference, is used in local market power mitigation, while the commitment cost limits what participants can bid in for minimum load cost and startup cost. The main challenge under the current framework is precisely the categorization of the various costs. Which ones are going to be variable versus fixed cost? Which ones are going to be minor versus major maintenance cost? Which ones should be accounted for in incremental cost versus commitment cost? The lack of a better classification of these costs represents a challenge for the CAISO when we need to update the 2-year period in default values, and also in the engagement on the negotiations with the specific resources. Therefore, the main objective of this proposal is to improve that classification, to have better accounting of those costs, be more consistent in their treatment when we have to go across a different spectrum of resources and technologies. And that will also ease the negotiation that we have to endure with market participants. Next slide, please. The first component of the proposal defines a set of principles for the classification of the variable maintenance cost, also the variable operations cost and the fixed cost. Variable costs are those that can vary directly with the production level of resources. The key principle here is that only variable costs will be considered in any of the three resource reference levels. That is, in either the default energy bid, the startup cost, or the minimum load cost. By principle, the variable cost can only vary with the run hours of the facility, for how long it has been running, the level of the production of the facility, the output level, or based on the frequency of startups and shutdowns of the facility. The variable costs are categorized in two main groups. The first group is the variable operations cost, which reflect mainly the cost of consumables like raw materials and chemicals, water. It doesn't include field cost. It doesn't include maintenance cost. The second main group is the variable maintenance cost, which are costs expected to reflect the future maintenance expenses and are expected to happen within the life of the resource. Having this well-defined set of cost framework provides the transparency needed to engage in the negotiations, achieve consistent outcomes across the evaluation of similarly situated resources, and will also help the ISO to inform and do the updates in the 3-year cycle that we have committed to do. Next slide, please. Using the cost framework that I just described, the second component of this proposal estimates default values for both variable operations others and maintenance others. The default values for variable operation costs were estimated in a cost study performed by Annexan. We contracted with them. They were based on publicly available information and were guided within the ISO cost framework that I just described. The default values for maintenance others were estimated by the ISO, using, again, publicly available information, and we had a very lengthy discussion with the stakeholders, and that added a lot of transparency to the calculation. These default others will be used in either of the three costs available for resources in the market. The default values are estimated by technology. In the proposal that is in detail, you can see that there will be a list of all the applicable default values that is by technology. Resources in the same group of technology will have effectively the same default value. Given the specific conditions of some resources, we have to caveat that if there is a default value that doesn't represent a good estimate of the actual resource cost, the participant still has the option to negotiate with the ISO a specific other for its resource. Next slide, please. Regarding stakeholders' position about this proposal, the ISO incorporated several suggestions and addressed multiple concerns about the definitions, about the calculation through the stakeholder process. The stakeholders are generally supportive of the final proposal. Perhaps the more consistent concern we heard through the policy process was that the default values for variable operations could be too low. After we learned about this concern in the first round of the stakeholder process, we addressed this concern with two changes that we put in the revised proposal. The first was to propose a default value that represents also variable maintenance costs, in addition to the initially proposed values of variable operations. And secondly, we also revised and scaled up the originally proposed consumable values to reflect higher water costs present in the west region that is applicable to the resources in the CAISO footprint in comparison to the reference that we were using from the east coast. The last concern we heard about this item was that the proposed default values for operation costs for wind resources specifically may be too low. We heard this concern. We made an effort to find publicly available estimates of those costs. We couldn't find a reliable source. We proposed a default variable operation adder for those based on the CAISO best estimates. And just a reminder, we further believe that this concern is greatly mitigated by the fact that the negotiated option is still available for the scheduling coordinators when a specific resource may fall outside the typical range of the default values. Finally, towards the end of the initiative, there was a concern that this proposal could be implemented too soon. We have accommodated this concern, and we are proposing an implementation date of January 2022. Next slide, please. To summarize, management requests the EIM governing body support the variable operations and maintenance cost review proposal. In summary, this proposal will provide for a more accurate accounting of operations and maintenance costs in the ISO market. It will also increase market efficiency by using a defined and consistent set of principles. It will also provide more flexibility for resources to reflect their cost. These newly proposed default operations and maintenance adders were developed through a lengthy process and open discussion with participants that provided a level of transparency into the calculations and assumptions we took. The proposal will also decrease the administrative burden on both market participants and the ISO by having a predefined set of default values that will be the first options for participants instead of engaging first in explicit negotiations. This is all what I have for this briefing. Thank you for your time. I will be happy to address any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you, Guillermo. Any questions from the governing body for either Guillermo or Mark? Okay, not hearing anything. Question?
This is Anita. So I just have a comment. So I want to just say that I appreciate how straightforward this is. I appreciate that stakeholders have an opportunity to bring forth data if they need to. And it appears that there was a good response in listening and working with stakeholders to get to this outcome, realizing that there probably will be some that come forward that the default doesn't work for them. But I think there was a lot of really good work here.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks for that presentation, Guillermo. Now we move on to the Department of Market Monitoring, and I think Amelia is unavailable, so I think Eric Hildebrandt's going to speak to us. Eric?
Yes, hello, this is Eric. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Great, good morning still. So the Department of Market Monitoring supports the proposed changes. We think they are a significant improvement in the current market rules and processes. As Guillermo explained, the proposal includes two key, I would call them enhancements, especially from our perspective. We do currently establish all the negotiated or customized values in the system. So first of all, this proposal more clearly defines which types of costs should go into the different cost inputs, such as energy per megawatt hour versus commitment costs, startup and minimum load costs. So I think this is a benefit both to participants and DMM when we're working with them to review costs, establish values. Secondly, it establishes a default, update default values. We've always had these for variable O&M, but this establishes a default for major maintenance adders, which can be added to startup and commitment costs. So we think that's going to be a big improvement that will be more administratively feasible and equitable, I think, for all participants, in that the costs that go into each bucket will be more clearly defined, for participants and DMM and the ISO, which is, ultimately approves, any value that's used in the system. Just to give you a sense of how the impact of this, we did a quick check, and in the EIM, 80% of the capacity is currently has a major maintenance adder, and so all of those at the current time have to be, negotiated or customized, established through a cost review. about 80% of the gas units in or capacity in California system as well has major maintenance adders. So, we are literally talking, tens of thousands of megawatts that still affect. Our sense is that, the ISO did work with stakeholders and incorporated their input as best it could in the initial defaults. And I would point out, to the extent that defaults are, too low for any entities, they still have the current option to utilize that process for establishing, a customized cost-based option. And I would add that, if we see, a significant amount of capacity not selecting the default and continuing to establish customized values, including all the new units that join EIM, I think this is something we would clearly report on and, recommend and work with the ISO to revisit the defaults and see if those needed to be raised. So, one thing, this whole process, it has given, extensive information on the cost inputs of many different units across the system. So the ISO is in a, it can compare, it has a lot of data to work with in terms of establishing values and adjusting those as needed. So with that, again, we strongly support the changes and think they're going to help, really help, kind of a win-win for the ISO and market participants.
Okay, thank you for that report, Eric. Governing body, any questions for Eric, DMM? Okay, hearing nothing, thank you, Eric. Appreciate your time and your work on this. Okay, next up on this topic is the public comment section. So, operator, if you want to open up the phone lines and ask.
If you'd like to offer a public comment at this time, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, at which point please state your name, affiliation, and comment. Again, that is #2 on your telephone keypad if you'd like to add a comment at this time. I'm not showing any comments at this time.
Okay, thank you, operator. Okay, now we'll move to the governing body decision. You see a potential motion up there on the screen. So any discussion or thoughts? Okay, well, it sounds, if nobody's got any additional things, like we're supportive. I'm supportive of it, certainly, and Eric pointed out at the end that if it isn't exactly right, I mean, there's two paths here. There's negotiated options that an entity could use if they think that these numbers are wrong. And then this is revisited at least every 3 years, and it could actually be revisited sooner if they get it really wrong. So sounds to me like a lot of the concerns have been at least addressed. So with that, I guess, if you want any discussion, I guess we throw it to Mr. Colleton.
Well, just to make it easy, I too would support this. This is Val, and I would recommend a verbal advisory input to the board.
Thank you. Everybody okay with that? Any dissension on that?
None.
Sounds good.
Great.
All right,
John?
Go ahead, Roger.
Yeah, let me go ahead and read the motion. Move that the EIM governing body will provide verbal advisory input to the ISO Board of Governors as discussed at its November 4, 2020 General Session meeting, supporting management's variable operations and maintenance cost review proposal. First?
Well, this is Rob. I will make the motion.
Thank you, Rob.
I'll second.
Second. That's Val.
This is Val.
Okay. Anita, your vote?
Aye.
Val?
Yes.
Rob?
Aye.
Carl?
Aye.
And John?
Aye.
Thank you, governing body members. The motion passes.
Okay, thanks everybody for that one. And let's see, I think that brings us down to item 9, which is the briefing on the EIM market benefits. Mark, you're up.
Thank you. This is our normal quarterly report out on the EIM benefits. This is for the third quarter, which included the August and September heat events. And most notably on that point, if you go to the next slide, we saw a higher level of benefits in this quarter than we normally have seen because of those conditions and the resultant high prices, especially in the Southwest. So we observed $119 million of gross benefits in the third quarter. That brings the total gross benefits since the start of EIM in 2014 not to $1.1 million, but $1.1 billion. It was last quarter that we celebrated the $1 billion mark. As you can see here, the benefits are kind of higher for the entities who are in the South and Southwest region, and that's really as a result of the transfers and the value of those transfers offsetting what were higher costs of energy in the Southwest region during the August and September heat events. Next slide, please. This slide just represents the report out of the diversity benefits. We measured diversity benefits in terms of the reduced amount of flexible ramping requirements that occur collectively versus individually. And we have seen about a 45 to 50% reduction as a result of those diversity benefits of those flexibility requirements. As you recall, we are doing flexible ramping enhancements and next year, and we expect that with that, some of these diversity benefits may be lessened a little bit, but still should remain robust in terms of helping share flexibility across the system. Next slide, please. The next set of slides just illustrate kind of the pricing performance observations of the real-time market, EIM market, and in some cases it compares to what are the bilateral or index prices that the entity would have used for imbalances absent EIM. And it's notable here that in the APS area, those proxy alternative bilateral prices were relatively significantly higher than the EIM prices, and that's as a result of those bilateral prices. Some of those indexes, which are peak or off-peak, don't have the granularity of the individual hourly prices. So as a result of that, the averages over these weekly periods look like they're higher, and they are higher, but that's, I think, more the granularity of the index, which did rise to, at times, higher than the ISO prices during the constrained periods or the high load periods. In other cases, you can see here that the prices generally are kind of rise on average during these heat events, and we are continuing to review the pricing performance and comparing it to the day ahead, just to see how that plays out, and some of that will actually be discussed in an upcoming Market Surveillance Committee meeting as it relates to the potential consideration of system market power mitigation going forward in the real time. Next slide, please. Next. These are just different areas. In the next slide. I will say that the Northwest part of the EIM did not see as higher prices. In part, that was due to some constraints that were happening from the Northwest, whereas the Southwest did experience the higher prices, as did the ISO in the southern region. Next slide, please. So this graph here is something we present on a quarterly basis, and it's just to compare the amount of wheel through, energy that is transferred through the EIM through an area, and comparing that to the gross amount of imports or exports into or out of an area. And we watch this because if we see the wheel-throughs occurring, more volume of wheel-throughs in an area than the import or exports into out of the area, that's an indication that EIM may be facilitating more transfers than maybe benefits that accrue from importing or exporting into an area. In this quarter, we did not see the wheel-through exceed the gross volumes of import or export. But this is still a topic that we are taking up in the EDAM discussions about whether these wheel-throughs need to have some kind of a mechanism for compensating the EIM area or the transmission provider that's facilitating the wheel-throughs. Next slide, please. In terms of the avoided curtailment and the resultant GHG reductions, third quarter is not a time because of the higher loads that we see a lot of reduced curtailment. There's not a lot of curtailment going on in the first place because there's significantly more load, and that load helps sink any oversupply. So we're not seeing that oversupply condition as much, and therefore we're not seeing the avoided curtailment much in this quarter. Next slide, please. In terms of transfer picture, we can see here that the transfers between areas or in and out of areas, generally speaking, you can see here a pattern where there's times there's transfers in or net transfers out of an area, which is exactly what we expect the EIM to do. For example, in the ISO in the lower left, we see that during the morning or the mid-afternoon, we see there is a transfer out of the area, whereas in the evening load pull, we see there is a fair amount of transfer into the area through the EIM transfer. And you can see here that for other patterns for the other areas kind of centered around zero, but there's times where the economics and the availability of energy goes one way and then at times the other way, which is exactly the way EIM is expected to work. Next slide, please. You can see here just the kind of pattern from SRP. There we see in the middle of the day there's imports coming in, but in the towards the evening hours they're exporting out, which is kind of the opposite end of what we see in the ISO. Next slide. Next. Oh, that was the SRP slide. Sorry. Next slide. I think that's the end of this presentation. I will say that I know we're continuing to review the conditions and how both the ISO and other areas perform during the heat events. As everybody knows, we did our preliminary root cause analysis in conjunction with the CPUC and the CEC. We are going back and doing some further review on how the EIM itself performed, and we are having discussions and seeking comments from the EIM entities as if there's anything that they've observed that we should take a look at further, or anything that we can learn from those events. Overall, what we're observing is that EIM generally performed as would have been expected. During the critical periods of August 14th to 15th, there were periods of time where the ISO did fail the sufficiency test, but the transfers were still in the transfer direction to the ISO, and we found that those transfers were not limited, but for a few intervals during the critical time. And so overall, the sufficiency test, from our perspective, worked the way we would have expected. It limited further transfers that would have potentially leaned on other areas, but yet it allowed for a certain amount of transfers that were supported in the previous 15-minute interval to occur. On September 6th, we are reviewing September 6th events just because there was an overlay of occurrences where there was tight conditions, and there was also a contingency event where about 900 megawatts of DC capability got limited, and we're reviewing that to see how the EIM was affected and how it performed between us and our neighboring balancing areas. And there may be some areas there that we can identify some opportunities for improvement or some automation to improve how the transfers and the transfer limits were performing between the areas. And that may be something that we work with the EIM entities to improve going forward. So with that, I will take any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Governing body, any questions for Mark?
No questions, but thank you for the update. Really like the messages you usually are able to deliver.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mark, I really appreciated the drill down into what happened this summer in the nexus to the EIM. And also, I guess there's going to be more work and studying, so we'll be very interested to see the results of those additional studies. So thank you again for your report.
Great.
Okay, next up is just the informational reports, and that's our policy calendar and the initiative milestones. Does anybody have any questions or comments on any of those?
Yeah, this is Val. On the policy calendar, Stacy Carpenter, I think you're, anyway, part of the meeting. I don't know how to say that, but anyway, yeah, thank you for being here. But I was wondering if it's about time to start showing the GRC actions that are going to be needed, even potentially in the first quarter of next year from both the governing body and the Board of Governors. And if it's premature, that's fine. It'll show up later.
Absolutely.
Anyway, you don't have to answer, but just a flag.
We can certainly do that, Val. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else on the informational reports? Okay, any future agenda items that anybody wants to put out there? Okay, hearing nothing on that, I guess a couple of things. I want to thank...
Sorry, I had to unmute. So just the only question I have about the policies is looking at the system market power mitigation. And depending on where that goes, right now we're listed as advisory. And I'm wondering if that might end up being a hybrid, depending on where it goes. I realize there's still some more work going on that, so I just want to raise a flag there.
Okay, and that would change accordingly, so thanks for noting that. All right, so I just wanted to thank Tegan, Christina, and Michael for producing this. I know it's never easy for me at least, but I appreciate all your efforts. And just a note to the governing body, we are going to move to executive session at 12:15, and you'll have another invitation sent to you for that meeting. So it'll be 12:15, we'll reconvene. And with that, this general session is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Prost.
Thanks, John.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.